white and black. So this is bringing together all of these points on race relations in the South during this time period. So we've seen white people codified white supremacy through their laws with segregation. With segregation and disenfranchisement, and then they enforce it all with violence through the so-called lynch law. On top of that, they're going to codify it and institutionalize white supremacy in things like history books. History is going to endorse white supremacy and justify all the actions carried out in its name. And so this is where we're seeing like the idea of the lost cause that still goes through to this day. You see that hopefully your elementary school and high school did not teach lost cause history, but I know that like for a fact, mine definitely did when I was in elementary school. So we see this go all the way through. The thing is, in the 1890s, the majority of Americans basically subscribed to the notion that black people simply were inferior to white people and thus they deserved to be treated as second-class citizens. A lot of times black people would be represented as less than human and as stereotypes. You can see this in this poem here and this picture. If any of you have ever read the novel by Agatha Christie, And Then There Were None, it's like a murder mystery novel. I read it back in like junior high and everything. Some students have read it, some students may not have. Yeah, its original title is actually 10 Little Boys. And that's because the book that helps solve the mystery and everything in it is, or I should say the poem that helps solve the mystery in the book is this poem that you can kind of see here. Now, the thing is, this poem would have been sung by minstrel shows, and it tends to be very derogatory towards a minority group. In this case, it says 10 Little Injuns. Now, Injun's a derogatory term for Native Americans. But you can see like one toddled home, one jumps off. There's a whole lot of more verses to this, but a lot of them it's implied that they die, and that's how it becomes 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, and that they're dying in really kind of ridiculous and stupid ways. And so it's very much, you wouldn't necessarily see 10 little white boys in this kind of a poem. And so this kind of poem and minstrel show song shows that when black people are put forward in the so-called media of this time, it's not the best representation of them. In fact, they're often, like I said, represented as less than human or stereotypes. And we see like Northern historians help this by putting it in their history books, but also you see a huge movement of scientific racism at this time period as well. National journals openly supported things like disenfranchisement and segregation. They accept the so-called Southern solution, being that disenfranchisement, lynch law, and segregation. The New York Times even reported that most people were for the so-called Southern solution because, and I quote, there was no other possible settlement. So people literally could not imagine black people being on par and equal with white people. You see Congress and the courts uphold discriminatory legislation. The thing is, Republicans might have fought for African American rights, except for they're so entrenched in like the North and the West, they don't really need the black vote, especially in the South. And so black American status even slips in the North. Now, technically you don't see the North disenfranchise African Americans, but they do segregate more and more often, especially after Plessy v. Ferguson. And a lot of white shop owners and everything wouldn't hire black workers. And if you have like anti-discrimination laws in the North, most of the time they're going to go unenforced. So what is the black response to all of this? The thing is, protest was basically ineffective, and oftentimes it was dangerous. There's going to be like a boycott of the streetcar system, and not one of these boycotts actually succeeded during this time period, unfortunately. Many black Americans are going to just choose to leave the South, and this is going to start the Great Migration and everything that I'll talk about a little bit more later. But most of the time, Black Americans just withdrew, developed their own community life within these restricted confines, especially like in the cities in the South. A lot of times they would set up, professional, business-oriented districts that served a primarily Black clientele. They'd have their own fraternal and self-help groups that would help with reform efforts in their own neighborhoods. A lot of times these reform movements are going to parallel white reform movements and white organizations. It's just they're doing it within their own communities because they're not getting help from the white community. We're going to see they're going to work especially hard to try to improve Black education in the city, especially where there's makeshift facilities at best. And in rural areas, there was basically no facilities for Black people to get an education. Giving you an idea of just how different it was between white versus Black in the South when it came to education, the student-to-teacher ratio in the South during this time was, for white people, 33 students to 1 teacher. For Black people, it was 71 students to 1. We see women really get involved, and they have a pivotal role, especially with disenfranchisement, because a lot of times Black women did have some sort of relationship with other white women's organizations, and they might push for them to help support, like, to improve health or education for African Americans. And so in this way, Black women actually became a really critical spokespeople for their race. You also have individuals that are going to get really involved with helping out the African American community. These are going to be individuals like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. So Booker T. Washington was born a slave in 1856 in Virginia. I could tell you all about his background. Really fascinating guy, but he'd go on to do things like fund the Tuskegee Institute for Black students in rural Alabama. He wanted to teach like trades and workplace discipline, and he wanted to teach African Americans like industrial skills. And the idea was that he wanted to give African Americans economic independence through things like vocational trainings. However, he is also going to argue, Booker T. Washington, something that comes to be known as the Atlanta Compromise. Now, this argument he made was basically that African Americans should accommodate themselves to segregation and disenfranchisement, so accept things like disenfranchisement and segregation until they could prove their economic worth to American society. Now, there's obviously some issues here because someone shouldn't necessarily have to prove their economic worth for people to help them. But the idea was that, African Americans have to kind of prove themselves to American society at this time for American society to accept them. Now, he did argue also in the Atlanta Compromise that white people should also help Black people in this. Help them, get an education and job training. Now, that being said, as much as Booker T. Washington pushed the Atlanta Compromise, he did still secretly fund like challenges to segregation and disenfranchisement. But even if someone was to go, yeah, this makes total sense and we're going to really fight for the Atlanta Compromise, the problem was it just wasn't viable because more and more African Americans would be shut out of the exact kind of jobs Washington wanted to train them in. So there's very little prospect for advancement. Now you're going to see individuals like W.E.B. Du Bois are going to attack the Atlanta Compromise. Du Bois was not for the Atlanta Compromise. He was also another prominent African-American leader. Lots of really fascinating stuff about him. I could tell you about things like he's the first African-American to earn a doctorate at Harvard. He also, just like Washington, is going to promote things like self-help, education, Black pride. He was very much against the Atlanta Compromise. I'm going to talk about that more in a second. But Du Bois is going to go on to help co-found in 1910 the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And this organization specifically was dedicated to restoring African American political and social rights. Now, as much as these two are butting heads on the Atlanta Compromise, they are going to agree on certain issues, such as like both of them and many other prominent African American leaders understood and saw Black success, especially in the South, as needing some white assistance, especially because white people controlled the politics of this time. So this is just a really quick primary source I wanted to read to you. This is W.E.B. Du Bois talking about Booker T. Washington and specifically a lot of the ideas of the Atlanta Compromise. So I want you to see how you can recognize those things. So it says, Mr. Washington distinctly asked that Black people give up, at least for the present, 3 things. First, political power. Second, insistence on civil rights. Third, higher education of Negro youth. The question then comes, is it possible and probable that 9 millions of men can make effective progress in economic lines if they are deprived of political rights, made a servile caste, and allowed only the most meager chance for developing their exceptional men? If history and reason give any distinct answer to these questions, it is an emphatic no. While it is a great truth to say that the Negro must strive and strive mightily to help himself, it is equally true that unless his striving be not simply seconded, but rather aroused and encouraged by the initiative of the richer and wiser environing group, he cannot hope for great success.